address this event.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? We're gathered here today to protest these Winter Olympics that are happening in China in just a few days' time. They're being called the Genocide Games. This name originates with the situation in Xinjiang, which really ought to be known as East Turkestan, because that's what the Uyghur people who live there call it. A decision in a UK tribunal recently declared that what is happening there is officially a genocide. So this hashtag, the Genocide Games, it's not just a campaign stunt, it's not just exaggeration by biased campaigners, it's a fact. What's happening there is a genocide. And do we really want to live in a world where governments who commit genocide get to host Olympic Games? Do we think that's wrong? I think it's wrong. Now, the last time China hosted an Olympic Games, as we know, was back in 2008. At the time, as Maggie has so eloquently explained to all of us, the IOC claimed that this would be a good thing. They said it would be a force for good. Now, what does that actually look like? I'm going to tell you about two Tibetans who undertook a little project around that time. One of them was a journalist called Tibet Solidarity, and the other was a monk called Xinjiang. And in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, they decided to make a film. They went around Tibet interviewing ordinary Tibetans to find out what they thought about Chinese rule, what they thought about the Olympics, and what they thought about the state of human rights in their country. That was all they did. They travelled around, they spoke to people, they recorded those people expressing their opinions, and they turned it into a 25-minute film. For this most terrible of crimes, both of them were arrested. Xinjiang did 3 separate stints in prison. He was tortured. Tibet Solidarity spent 6 years in a Chinese jail. 6 years for making a 25-minute documentary. I mean, can you imagine what you have to do in this country to actually spend 6 years in jail? It's something a hell of a lot more violent than making a 25-minute documentary. And that is what progress in human rights looks like in China. That is what being a force for good means in China. It means journalists being thrown in jail. It means ordinary Tibetans being arrested and tortured for having an opinion. If that's a force for good, seriously. And what else is happening? Since then, we've seen a steady deterioration in human rights across Tibet and across other territories under Chinese control. I'm sure you've all heard about detention camps in East Turkestan, Xinjiang. About 1 million Uyghurs detained in these camps. There are Uyghurs living here in the UK who are afraid to phone their own relatives. They're afraid to speak to their parents, to their siblings, because of what might happen to those relatives. Can you imagine being afraid to call your own relatives, your own friends? That's what people are living under. That's what improvement in human rights means for the Uyghurs. In southern Mongolia, they are facing cultural assimilation. Education in the Mongolian language is being curtailed, and replaced with enforced education in Mandarin as a way of systematically stamping out their culture in order to enforce Chinese control in southern Mongolia. In Hong Kong, we've seen what's happened. The new security law has been enacted, the elections have been overturned, the politics there has been completely upended. I'm not going to say more about Hong Kong because my friends have explained it very clearly. Taiwan is facing incursions, facing the threat of invasion. I mean, we're talking about an Olympics here, and Taiwan aren't allowed to compete under their own name. They're not allowed to carry their own flag into those Olympic Games. And the Tibetans. Since 2008, there have been a number of military crackdowns, new security laws, all aimed at criminalizing expressions of cultural identity. In 2008 itself, there was an uprising in Tibet. It was huge. It was the biggest uprising that Tibet has seen in decades. As a result of that, China sent in the troops. People were shot. 227 deaths were confirmed. 100 of those were people who were shot on the day. A number of others died of their injuries or from torture or other related causes. 6,810 people were arrested simply for taking part in the protests. What we're doing here today would get us arrested in Tibet. Us standing here today, holding flags, making speeches, having opinions, holding placards, that's enough. That's what gets Tibetans arrested and tortured. I mean, not even that. I used to run an organization called Tibet Watch. We had a team that got information from sources in Tibet. We heard of a man in Tibet who was arrested and interrogated because he received a phone call from his brother. The issue was that his brother lived in Australia, and he was interrogated under suspicion of sharing state secrets with outside forces. They have these very broad and ambiguously worded national security laws that allow them to arrest people for things like that, for calling their relatives. Like in southern Mongolia, there's a systematic process of suppressing the language and the culture. Tibetan children are being sent to boarding schools where they are forced to learn in Chinese. They're taken away from their families. China presents this as a way of lifting them out of poverty and providing a good education, but it is a systematic attack on Tibetan culture and identity. It's what's known as cultural genocide. So this is what the improvement in human rights looks like. This is why we must stand up against it and raise our voices against these genocide games. So we need to stand up for Tibetans, for Uyghurs, for Southern Mongolians, for Hongkongers, for Taiwanese, and for the people in China who are working to defend their own human rights in their own country. Because the issue is not the Chinese people, the issue is the Chinese government. So we stand in solidarity with all people affected by their repression. No to Beijing 2022. No to these genocide games. Free Tibet. Berg Yellow.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for your speech and sharing about the ongoing situation the Tibetan people are facing right now.